Good morning, good people. This is your host, Calvin Anderson, with the Check-In With podcast. We have another special guest with us today. Very excited to speak to this person. Everyone just give a lovely and warm welcome to Raushia Coles. Raushia, how are you?
Yeah, good. Good to be with you this morning, Calvin. Thank you for inviting me on.
No, thank you for saying yes. I mean, I really do appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing all the insights and everything that you have to share with us today. Raushia, if you could introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us what made you get into the mental health sector.
Yeah, so I've been working in health and social care for the past 14 years. I've been a qualified counsellor for the past 9 and a counselling supervisor for the past 5.
Yeah.
And so my interest in working with mental health comes from my own sort of struggles and my own lived experience as a teenager, growing up.
Yep.
I just found it really, really difficult. I felt like I struggled, and I now know that I had undiagnosed ADHD, but back then, back in the 80s, it was often looked upon as you have a mental health disorder. And I think a lot of my anxiety and my depression stemmed from trying to live in a neurotypical world where there wasn't that much understanding. There is a big movement, isn't there now, towards understanding neurodivergent people and children in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what led me to want to sort of be a wounded healer and to help other people. And I worked really hard by going to university and spent a lot of time trying to sort of rebuild myself, where my 20s were really tumultuous and really challenging.
Yeah.
And I wanted to sort of give back to other people in similar situations. Access to affordable counselling is not available to all. It's a sort of luxury. So I do a lot of ADHD coaching. I support people who are struggling to get diagnosed or just struggling in the workplace. And I use my sort of cold counselling to support people that couldn't normally access provision because you're sometimes priced out.
And I think it's so necessary to have individuals like yourself who, aren't charging an incredible price, so it can be affordable for those who actually do need it and that want to do therapy.
Yes.
So I think that's so powerful. I commend you on that. Being a wounded healer, Raushia, what led you up to becoming a trauma therapist?
Yeah, so I am an EMDR trauma trained therapist. And I think I've noticed, as I have a daughter, she's 16 years old, there is not, for children and young people, it's not naturally built into them, those emotional coping skills. And I think that's what we really do in terms of the EMDR protocol. We build in a safe space. We build in that containment. We support people to feel safe in their own bodies. And I feel as though if we can do that with our children, we'll have a lot less traumatized adults who are going through the school system, who are struggling so much, to fit into society. And they're often marginalized. There's often a lot of social and economic problems and unregulated, dysregulated adults who are just out there using lots of fix-it behaviours to try and cope, perhaps somewhat maladaptive coping strategies, but coping strategies after all. And I feel as though if we can offer early interventions and support people to be able to self-regulate without having to use substances, without having to use the shopping, the gambling, or the other, digital diazepam is another big thing. I'm sure you see it in your teaching profession. A lot of children very heavily invested in gaming or iPads or smartphones because it's an avoidance, isn't it? It's a way to get out of self and to fix those uncomfortable feelings. So I'm really, and I didn't have that growing up. I struggled quite a lot to regulate my feelings and my emotions. And for a lot of years, I was categorised as behaviourally challenged. But really, I think that I'd never been given the vocabulary, I'd never been given the words to talk about how I was feeling about my inner world, how isolated I felt, how lonely I felt, and how apart from I felt. And so I think by building connection and building community, I see that working with children, that sort of pro social model. And obviously that feeds into the work that I do with prisons.
Two questions for you. How is regulating yourself now different as an adult to when it was when you were younger? And speaking more in terms of working with the younger generation and those who may be in prison or, in the system in that way. But what advice would you give to the listeners who may know someone or know someone who's going through something similar?
Yeah, I mean, and I think when I was younger and I was growing up in the sort of early 90s, we didn't, you just sort of got on with things. We would be out all of the time. I would be up the park, in the rec, doing whatever with all my friends. My mum worked 12-hour night shifts as a nurse and would sleep in the day. So I was a bit of a latchkey kid. I would sort of come and go as I pleased and didn't really enjoy school, so didn't really want to be in school. I found it quite punitive. I found it quite arbitrary, the rules. And obviously it's catered for a certain demographic of children.
Mm.
So I would become quite dissociative. I would sleep in class. I would appear quite oppositionally defiant. But I think it was because I was struggling. I couldn't do the work. I was quite disengaged. So I think for any parent or carer who's struggling, I think hooking into the schools. Nowadays, you have a lot more, you have ELSAs in schools, you have much more ability to access that provision if you know what to ask for and who to ask for. So the Senko at the school, if children have emotional problems, they can see in some schools they have access to a psychologist there that can pick up. And you have, I'm assuming in London they have a lot of young people services where kids can self-refer and they can go. And I suppose it's making it more acceptable to access counselling and therapy. So if they've had bereavements, if they've had a loss, if they're struggling with their families, perhaps a parent's been incarcerated or a parent's out of work, there's a lot of financial problems, that to know that the counselling is there and that they can access it. I used to work at a charity in Portsmouth where we would offer affordable counselling. If you were on benefits, you could make a donation, you could pay £1. And it would be at the highest on the scale, it's means tested, it would be £25. So I think, and a lot of the young people services are just totally free. There's no contribution. So I think having conversations with children at home saying it's okay, it's all right to not be all right. And doubly checking, are you okay? No, are you really okay? Like what's been going on? I believe that every behaviour is a communication. And I believe that if children are acting up at home or in the school, that there's something underneath that. And perhaps it's our jobs as professionals or parents or carers to try and unpick that before it ends up in that sort of school to prison pipeline where children who often have neurodivergence can't fit in mainstream school and they end up the same as me in year 10, put on a reduced timetable and effectively managed out of the school. So if you look at the thousands of children that are like that now since COVID, they call them the ghost children that are not accessing school. Thousands of children that aren't in education. And so if they're not in that safe place for those 6 hours a day, what are they doing? Often they are on the streets. Often they're in danger of being sort of groomed into county line gangs. There is a lot of deprivation in Portsmouth. And there is a lot of, the children that can't keep up academically, their choices are limited. So I think it's really important to try and find things that for kids that they can feel valued and that they can feel as though they have some worth and they're worthy. They might not be academically achieving in the top sets, but they're still worthy human beings. And I think early from sort of younger than senior school, but particularly in senior school, I was getting the messaging that you are not a good enough person. You are not a worthy person. In fact, you are a bad person. And I played to that type. I felt typecast and I played to that. And I spent a lot of time in my 20s, being a rebel without a clue, feeling as though that I didn't, if this is authority and if this is the life and the world, I want no part of it. But actually, I just became more disenfranchised and struggled more and became further and further away from, became more and more disconnected from my family and any sort of support networks. So I think in answer to your question, Calvin, I think it really is about connection and community.
Connection and community. Definitely a topic or subject that needs to be spoken about more, especially when you mention about there being the thousands and thousands upon children who aren't in school for those 6 hours and being in these environments where to them they may not know what's happening because it feels a certain way that may feel good to them at the point, but the end result or the results that are coming will be something that is detrimental to themselves and to the people that they love. And it makes me speak on or think more on trauma. I wanted to ask you, Raushia, can you open up the word trauma and unpick it just so listeners have a better understanding of the word, what it entails, and what actually is it from your perspective and knowledge?
Yeah, and being a counsellor yourself, you will know we're trained out of the DSM-5. So there's criteria that looks at certain things, and we're often pathologized as you now have a mental health condition. I'm very much a trauma responsive counsellor. So I read the Indicative Trauma Manual by Dr. Jessica Taylor, which offers an alternative to the DSM-5, which is like subjective. Everything is a reaction to what's going on around us. And so, if you look from a sort of the old school language, you would look at PTSD, which is large T trauma. If you've had a car accident or been in serious threat for your life or somebody else's life was threatened in that one-off incident, you could be categorized as having PTSD. I think in terms of small T trauma, which I work with lots of people, I have international clients who exhibit complex PTSD symptoms just from living their life. So I have students that are in America. Here in England, we would have fire in the schools. Kids would do fire drills. There they do shooting drills. Yeah, so they have to hide under the tables in case a shooter comes into their school. That gives people trauma because they are in fear of going to the train station. They are in fear of going to school. So they live in hypo-arousal. It means your limbic system is often hijacked when you're experiencing some trauma symptoms. And you become really hypervigilant and you're really heightened because it is actually a threat to life, isn't it? If you know that there is the potential of someone coming into your classroom and there being a mass shooting, they just take it for granted that standing at the tube station that they could be killed. So that prolonged exposure to stress, particularly young people, that build-up of cortisol, but to have the prolonged exposure to stress. So I work with people who've experienced domestic violence. They exhibit complex PTSD symptoms as well, because they're constantly wondering who's going to come in. They hear a bang and they wonder what's going to happen next. And I think I often speak to people, particularly the international clients, when I try to speak to them about, but that's trauma, to try and normalize that word. And they are very resistant. They say, oh, no, I haven't had trauma. There is a real stigma about the word that I find quite interesting. Like, oh, no, they believe that trauma is, a plane crash, a car wreck, one incident, a one-off traumatic incident. So I think a lot of my work in terms of the distress tolerance and given the emotional coping skills is looking at what is prolonged stress. What does that do the body holds the score, doesn't it? It can make us so unwell physically if we live. The world today causes trauma. What's going on internationally causes trauma. When it was COVID and you put on the news and you see the death rates going up and up and up and up, and you watch that is trauma. But it's about how do we work with trauma and what do we do? And I think it's the same as what we need to do with children, giving those emotional coping skills, building that scaffolding and that resilience so that people can cope under stress, because we can't change the world as is, can we? We can only deal with reality. And I do a lot of acceptance commitment therapy, which is doing exactly that. It's an offshot of CBT, and it's looking at affecting behavioural change. So we can't change the world around us, but what can we change for ourselves today in terms of behaviour? How can we make a safe space for ourselves? How can we support ourselves just for today?
And I want to further that with you. I want to ask you, how can we manage trauma on a daily basis if we're not in therapy? And what coping skills could we utilize?
Well, and what's wonderful about the internet is that we can just go on there. If we looked up emotional regulation, we would be bombarded with things. And what works for one person doesn't work for all. So
100%.
I always offer the clients 50 emotional coping skills. And it's all textbook things that you would find offline. Square breathing, mindful colouring, walking in nature, being in touch with your five senses. If you look from a dialectic point of view, you could use tipping skills. There's so much out there to support people as an individual, because if you try, my experience as a therapist is, if you go with one or two things, people say, no, that would never work for me. I don't want to put on a mindful app and do a body scan. Oh, okay. There's 50 things that you could look at here. Everyone can pick out 3 to 5 things out of 50. And it can just be simple things like mindfully washing up, trying to bring yourself back into your body, mindfully washing your hair, trying to be present rather than always escaping our body, trying to leave our body, trying to dissociate. It's just trying to bring it back to self, I believe.
No, I definitely agree with you on that. And I definitely would love to hear more about the 50 points that you have and tips for the listeners. And I want you to speak on, and you said it earlier in our first question when you spoke about therapy being accessible to people. Raushia, can you speak on people not being able to access therapy and the barriers that come with that?
Well, I think that one of the huge barriers is an assessment process. I've worked in a lot of drug services, so you have such a traumatized population. So that's homelessness, mental health, domestic violence, substance issues. And the barrier is their behaviour is challenging. Often it gives the professional the ability to say, oh, they're too much, they're too difficult, they won't comply, they're very combative, they don't turn up at 10 o'clock in the morning. Then when they need to do their assessing, some services here use the Vanguard model, which is a more trauma responsive way, which is you have the assessment and you stay with that worker. Because I believe in terms of trauma, asking people to explain again and again their life story is not therapeutic. And that's quite an old school way of being. Give me your whole rundown of your whole life, starting when I was born in 1980. But holistically, in the here and now, what can we do to give you some ease and comfort in the immediacy? Yeah, because we cannot change all of this stuff that and this is how I was trained in regards to EMDR. If we can give people a sense of safety in the here and now, we can help them to process those traumas from the past, because they're learning how to cope with trauma today. They're able to go back and come back into the present day. But I think there is a lot of barriers, in terms of, the biggest thing that's bandied about is, clients aren't ready. They're not ready. And it's so, okay, so how as professionals can we create an environment where they feel it's all, I believe it's all about the relationship. I believe it's all about that working alliance. I believe it's all about, connection and being there with that person.
Yeah.
So what can we do to try and facilitate them being ready and to facilitate change? And that was sort of my experience. I came into contact with somebody. She was a nurse, and she was so supportive to me at a time when I was sort of 27 years old, and I really, really needed that help. And I would be exhibiting quite challenging behaviour, but she would say, "Oh, Raushia," she put an arm around me. "What's going on?" Because obviously I was quite heightened, and I didn't need punishing. I needed care and support, but often the behaviour invites rejection.
Yeah.
So it's a circle, isn't it? It's a circle that we go round in with, "Oh, they're not ready. Oh, they're not willing. Oh, it's not their time." But I felt that it was really sort of important that she met me where I was at.
Hmm.
I try and do that with my clients.
No, Russia. I think that's just a sort of, you know, um, meeting clients where they're at. Yes, as you said, there is the, oh, this person's not ready. They're not ready, and sometimes even saying that is even more detrimental to the person, rather than just starting where they're at. Even if it is simple check-ins at first, before it is a 50-minute or however long the session is, just a simple check-in, just a, how are you doing today? How, speak to me on this, or if I can just sit with you in this time where I don't have to say anything, I can just hold the space, if that's helpful. I think, like you said, just creating and facilitating just a space, and
Yeah.
just building upon that once the client is ready or feels like, you know what, this person's been with me for a week now. They haven't said much. They've just literally just been in the space with me just in case I need it. Maybe next week I'll be confident enough to start speaking on what is inside of me and what's on my mind. So I really, really like that point that you just gave.
And I think that COVID changed a lot for people. The BACP started recognising walk and talks.
Mm.
I think that the most beneficial work I ever used to do, I used to work in a high intensity hostel, uh, very chaotic, challenging behaviour. But I would work in the open resource room and just making some food with the clients, playing a game with the clients, sitting and then helping them get onto the computer, teaching one lady to ride a bike, going out in the fresh air. Those key work sessions were the best interventions because I wasn't sitting there with a piece of paper and a clipboard trying to do outcome stars and churn statistical data. Because my experience is people don't like to feel that way. I didn't used to like to feel that way. I used to feel like I wanted to feel as though somebody understood me and could just be there in relation to me. So whether it was taking people to a dentist appointment or just sitting with someone whilst they cry, you're just being present, you're showing up in the room. And I think there's a lot to be said for those little 5-minute brief interventions. I think they can be introduced in prisons. I think they should be introduced in schools, just so that, instead of saying, right, off to the learning room, you're naughty, you're bad, what about, let's take a moment. What is going on? In that moment, what happened? And I did a lot of work in terms of shame resilience theory with the Griffin Project, looking at how a lot of anger and rage comes from shame. And if we can look at and get underneath why people are feeling so shamed, oftentimes the reactive behaviour is dispelled. It's embarrassment, it's humiliation. And you will see that when working with perpetrators of domestic violence. A lot of times they feel humiliated, they feel out of control, and they want to exert their control on the other. So if we can just sort of get underneath that, then the recidivism will reduce.
Mm. Definitely agree. Definitely agree with that. And I guess it's, like you said again, just having that rapport with a person, knowing the person, knowing, okay, this person is this way, and I can see when I say this, or they react to this thing in that way. Okay, let me now work with that let me now cater to that to make sure that everything I say, everything I do is not necessarily a trigger, but it's something that can help them through the triggers that they may have on a daily basis. No, that is Rush.
Yes.
I really do agree with that. Tell us more about unlocking potential and also the work you do within the Forgiveness Project program you told me about called Restore.
Yeah, so that is Restore is what I did the shame resilience paper
Okay.
with Restore. The program goes into the female estate, into Eastwood Park, into various estates, female prisons in the country. And previous to, I've worked with them for about 8 years now. So previous to lockdown, we would offer a 4-day program where we would sit with the women and we would support them with art therapy, with spoken word, building connection so that they had that safe space to sort of share how they were feeling on the wing, how it feels to be removed from your children, to be isolated, to be shunned. You know, as women, they get so much more judgment because they should be at home being mothers. They should be doing this, that, and the other, and they're not. So the shame is huge. So we did a big body of work around that shame resilience theory. And I would give my experience, and then the group would share back. And I think that is that is the key to build connection so that people see, oh, other people have suffered like me. Other people have experienced trauma and hardship, but there is a way up and out. There is, if we can find people, and that sort of links into our unlocking potential. It launches today. On part of the 16 associates. So Giffen Jones has got an amazing program that goes into prisons. We're going in January to speak to staff and the residents. And there is a combination of people from the Ministry of Justice. We have governors, we have lifers, we have people of lived experience he wants people from both sides of the sort of door to come together and to look at how can we create safer environments that are fair and just for all. So that everybody is probably a lot like the school system, isn't it? So that everyone's not at loggerheads and fighting each other, that we can try and come from a place of, compassion lens therapy, and to build a network of professionals who can go in and speak so that we can really start changing the culture moving forward. So I'm really, really excited about that opportunity. And I've been speaking with Giffen for several years now, and we had met 8-9 years ago. He put me in touch with the Forgiveness Project, and so I would speak for Restore. And now I think that obviously there is a movement to reduce offending. There is a movement to try and introduce positive changes for people. And I feel as though my expertise as a counsellor and as a trauma trained counsellor, and I can bring that to the landings where the people need it the most. I think there's a saying, isn't there, that it says a lot about the country, how they treat their prisoners. Look at how the country treats their prisoners. And oftentimes the prisoners are the people that get the worst. People say, well, they should be punished. The punishment is being removed from your family. That is the punishment. You cannot leave the prison. You can't see your kids at Christmas. You can't celebrate your birthday with your children. That's the punishment. So I don't think that the oppressive punishing systems at play, well, it just habituates violence and crime, the revolving door. The cycle goes on. And I'm really sort of inspired to be a cycle breaker, Calvin, with not only with my own children, but people in the school system locally and the prison estate nationally.
A cycle breaker. That's such a powerful position to take, Raushia. Speak more on that for me before we go on to the next question. Being a
Yeah.
cycle breaker.
I think that me and my friend, we often laugh. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, child raising was very shame based. And there was a lot of like, you're bad, you're naughty, a lot of shame. And so learning about, through my experience of becoming a counsellor and working in the prison estate and seeing the school system, not just for myself 30 years ago now, but my daughter in the same school 30 years on, I see that there's a lot of shame and blame. And I see that in terms of psychology, shame and blame doesn't really work. So I've really worked hard to be quite adaptive in my parenting. I've tried to be a gentle parent, which is trying to see past the behaviour, to still be firm but fair, the same as I am with my clients. So I worked recently, how do we end cycles? How do we break that? Well, we educate. So if we work with people who have not only seen domestic violence as children, they now feel as though that is conflict resolution as adults, it's about educating them about how that's not really the best way to be, and about if we can use our words and connect and communicate, we're perhaps not going to need to use brute force to push our will onto others. But that's systemic, isn't it? They learn from very small, bigger people, whether it's the school, authorities, they force their will onto people who are weaker, smaller, more vulnerable. So if we can see how that's, all the systems interlink and everything needs to change, I think being a cycle breaker is starting at home with my own daughter. And then the ripple effect is how I interact with the clients. I was working recently with a lot of prison leavers in the community. So they would leave on license, they would come to a housing project, and I would run interventions twice a week. And that is looking at brief intervention therapies, looking at their anger and their stress and their child, like, where did this all come from? Why are you operating the way that you are today? It's more of a sort of motivational interviewing approach, looking at how come we've ended up here, rather than you're bad, lock the door, throw away the key, you're written off as people, because that just perpetuates the shame and the stigma and the violence and the revolving door. So I'm a big believer in working with people and all of their behaviours, as maladaptive as they might seem, because that will, I believe, change things for my daughter growing up in this world.
That's so powerful, especially as you said. And the key thing I took away from that was starting from home, starting from where you dwell and where you are occupying, changing that atmosphere within that environment, and then that having a ripple effect in terms of everything else in your life, and seeing that in some ways, like you said earlier, having like a full circle moment. So it's starting from one place and then going around into all the other areas. So that's so powerful. And I think that's definitely something for myself and the listeners to take home, is like, start from where you are, start from your base, and then slowly begin to allow yourself to, or allow it to affect all the other areas in your life also. Because you can't, if you don't start from home, how then can you be able to, push that narrative into the other areas outside of that? Because home is where you start. Home is where you begin. So if you start at home and you work on those things and build it to a place where, okay, everything's cohesive. We are in a place where we understand each other, whether it be a sibling or a child or yourself or family. Once it starts from that and you have that structure, and then you bring it into other structures that you're part of, that's very powerful, Raushia. I really do like that.
Well, you're absolutely right, Calvin. It's about building in consequential thinking, isn't it? And that's what we're trying to teach our children,
Yeah.
the youth of today, and people in prison. Like, you do this behaviour, there will be a consequence. And it's learning that we can be more gentle with that. We don't have to ram it down people's throats. We can just say, this is life. This is how life is. We don't always have to like it. But how can we find a way to sort of live in this world with the path of least resistance? Because I was told years ago by a great counsellor when I used to work in a residential rehabilitation centre, and I was very hardline. I wanted the clients to come, wanted them to listen to what I was saying. And he used to say, you meet them like this all the time. You meet them head on. You need to learn how to be like water. Go around the outside, because water eventually over time will corrode the hardest of stones. And I really I liked that analogy. I liked that metaphor. I'm a Gestalt therapist, so we love metaphors.
Yeah.
And I could really sort of take that and be like, yeah, I'm going to be like water. And then when I had a more adaptive approach, I noticed that the carrot, not the stick method works so much better. So then it becomes easier to build on that in my home environment with my daughter and with the children that are around me, because I see, shouting and being cross or punishing or controlling, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
The approach doesn't work.
A more gentle approach, more understanding approach. And you said the word earlier, having more compassion works. Powerful.
Yeah, for ourselves and others.
Listeners, if you're hearing this, which I know you are, extend yourself some grace, some compassion, even if it is hard to do, and just allow yourself to navigate situations in life in the most gentlest way possible. Only because at a calm state or a calm place within yourself and within your mind, you're able to take on more and learn more and share more with others. So no, Raushia, thank you so much for that. I want to touch more in terms of your childhood and stuff. Living and growing up in Portsmouth, what would you have wanted to help, or what would you have wanted growing up to help you in that environment?
Well, my mum, she was a nurse. She lived in Portsmouth all her life. My dad, he was in the Egyptian Navy. He came over and met my mum, and they were married. They had me for 9. They were together for 9 years. But obviously, I was a little mixed race baby. I looked like Mowgli in a very, very white. Portsmouth is a very white area. So that was quite difficult for me. I think I would have liked my father not to have left when I was 9 and returned back to Egypt. And I had very, very limited contact with him. So there was a lot of abandonment and rejection that fueled me feeling as though, why should I try? Like, why should I be good? But people always leave me. That sort of imprinted me from early. What would I have liked? I'd have liked, I would have liked, to be able to go and get support with what was going on for me, for the teachers to sit down and speak to me and see why was I behaving the way that I was behaving? Why did they feel that I was this ball of energy that was always misconstrued as being angry and bad? But I feel as though I was not, I didn't have A, the vocabulary to speak about what was going on, B, the environment where I could speak about what was going on. And so I was sort of doubly disadvantaged. I was very I watched back videos of me when I was very young, and I was just sort of stood back from all the other children. Since turning 44, I realised that I had ADHD. They say the high, extreme ADHD, hyperactive and inattentive. So that was all the energy that was coming out of me all the time. And I was always, mixed up bad or having some mental health problems. But I was lonely. I was isolated. I had a single parent who had to work all the time. I had a father who sort of abandoned and rejected me. If you just look at that in the first 9 years of a child's life and mental years, there was an awful that could have been different. But our parents do the best that they can with tools that they have. The same as what I do with my children.
And the second part of that question is, what would you like to see moving forward within our field over the span of the next 5 to 10 years?
Systemic overhaul. I believe there's £22 billion being pumped the education system so that there'll be more counsellors in schools, so that they do more social and emotional support for the children that really need it the most. So there is a reason why they're struggling. Just about how I spoke about, I was excluded at 9 years old. They said you either take her out of school or she has an expulsion record. I would like for that to be different and for people to get underneath what's going on with these kids. They need a bit of kindness. They need a bit of compassion. They need a bit of care and support, and having professionals, a wraparound system So the early help hubs to be reintroduced so that parents can go and feel as though they can say to social services when they're struggling, and get the early help teams involved before it ends up child in need, child protection, legal strategy, removal of children. So that's the complete overhaul, not obviously an overhaul of the prison system. So how we treat our prisoners there, being more transformed in our approach and more educational, putting in programs so that we can teach people how, if people are turning up in prison and they're homeless, we're telling them, here's a tent to leave with,
Mm.
the problems, which is homelessness, poverty, not being educated above a, real age, children, so no, then. So it's education, like the English, the maths, the emotional literacy that needs, I believe, to be put in the schools and in the prisons. I think it might take more than 5 to 10 years, though.
I definitely agree with you, and I think it's so important. I think I put a post on LinkedIn a while ago. Having a therapist should be mandatory in institutes of education because of things like inspections, and like you so rightly said, having that emotional support and care for the young children, the children who are transitioning from secondary to college, those who are going from college to university, from university into the work, every single step or part of the journey for an individual should be covered by or have that support in place. So I thank you so much.
Therapeutic. Yeah.
Definitely. Go ahead.
You said there, Calvin, and is really important in terms of who they put in there. So if you have an educational psychologist, sure, they're fantastic, but they do sit there with their clipboards and their assessment and their formulation.
Yeah.
Whereas if we had counsellors in there, it's a little bit like the children that they're trying to reach, that spoke a little bit like the children that they're trying to reach, that were like, oh, have a chat, let's go and have a walk and to meet them in a place that's accessible to them, rather than you put them with the children in front of the educational psychologist. The children won't say, we've offered the child help, but they're not willing to take it. And round we go again. It's about how are we offering that access to provision, isn't it?
Yeah. So for you, Raushia, if we was to start from, say, primary, secondary, college, uni, who would you put in place in terms of, like you said, an educational psychologist, counselor? Where would each person within our field need to be in the journey for a child within the Institute of Education?
Well, I think as a parent, a parent should be at the centre of every, if you look at offer letters, they say the parent is at the centre of all person-centred. Translates my experiences, it's sort of great written down, but how that translates. So I think the overhaul would be, if we're saying, and a lot of services, we always bandy around, I'm trauma informed, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? Yeah, if you're placing the client or the child at the centre of all that we do, are we listening? Have we even ask the child what they would like, what they need? And if they don't know what they'd like and what they'd need, let's help them to find that. You would think that that's just goes without saying,
Yeah.
wouldn't you?
No, definitely. And unfortunately, it's not. Raushia, before I let you go, there's a few fun, rapid questions I'd like to ask you just so the listeners can get to know you a bit more. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
My first question is, what is your favorite season and why?
Definitely the summer. I love sunbathing. So as soon as it gets hot, maybe even April when the daffodils are out, it's quite hot. I just like the sunshine. I feel as though being out in the environment, being with the sun on my face, that vitamin D, is very good for well-being.
If you had to pick a location to work remotely in, where would it be and why?
Well, if I could work remotely, I'd say Jamaica or the Maldives. Somewhere hot where I could sit on the beach with a canopy so that you didn't get the glaze on your phone or your iPad when you were working.
Nice. That's actually two good locations, Jamaica and Maldives. Nice. Do you have a favorite quote? Raushia?
Probably that quote that I said earlier. I think that it was Nelson Mandela, wasn't it? Oh, I hope that I'm right there. That said that it says a lot about society, how they treat their prisoners. I think that's very true. If we just look, like, that is one of my favourite quotes. I hope I quoted it right.
Two more. Do you have a favorite book or movie?
I love Jessica Taylor's work. I've read all of her books. So Sexy but Psycho. Read it. It's a good read. And so it's about the pathologization of women. How, if you're hot, you're crazy, you're hot. But actually, that is all pathologizing. And that is what feeds down to young girls. And, obviously, I've got a 16-year-old daughter. And, I think that the book is really insightful.
Okay, Jessica Taylor. I'll definitely check that out. And last question for you, Raushia, is I want you to finish this sentence for me. If it wasn't for therapy, I would.
Be dead.
Can you expand on that for us? Just not.
Well, I know we're limited with time, but just to sort of round it up, I was sort of hurtling, to the 27 Club. There is lots of people that sort of live fast, die young. And I was that sort of person at 27 years old.
Yeah.
And then it's, a cluster of incidents happen that would be a whole nother podcast that led me to go into residential. So I went into residential for 9 months where I was, supported by amazing, fantastic counsellors. The counsellor, helped me no ends and taught me about my behaviours were going to kill me. If I didn't change how I behaved and how I operated, I was heading for an early grave quite imminently. So that sort of self and realising that if nothing changes was so powerful for me. And it was the springboard for me to become a, wounded healer, to become a therapist, become a trauma counsellor, to become a supervisor, to work in all these prisons, to do all of this amazing stuff. It was the result of how, how I became a counsellor. Is they used to say to me, you're so good in group. Because I used to be able to chat, I used to be able to see it and spot it, and everybody else, all their issues, all the things they needed to change. Yeah. And so I would always be speaking a lot in group, and they were like, you should be a counsellor. You'd be an amazing counsellor. And my counsellor in there, very tough Scottish guy, he had a big scar down his face, and he was a humanist and Gestalt counsellor. And I used to think, wow, he's amazing. Once he would just sometimes sit there and not speak, like we just had this standoff of who's going to crack first. But I just used to think, wow, he's just had this aura about him. And I thought, okay, I will. I'll go off and be a counsellor. And I went off and I did my level 2 and my level 3. And then I went and did my 4 and my 5, and I thought, I can do it. I can do anything that I put my mind to. They had belief in me. They saw something in me. The same as that nurse, Claire. I'll give her a shout out, Claire Skinner. Yeah. The same as that nurse saw something in me. She saw past my behaviour and she used to think, you can do better. You can do better. And she helped me to sort of get into that residential. And then when I got there, I was just nurtured and loved and cared for. And I thought, everything that I've been given here, I want to take out and give to others.
Powerful.
So that's what I've done.
No, that's powerful, Raushia. No, thank you for sharing that with me. I know you didn't go into all depths, but thank you so much. That is, life-changing. Raushia, where can people find you? They've heard you speak today. Want to get in contact?
So colescounselling.co.uk. Give my website a look. colescounselling.co.uk. I can be booked remotely. Obviously, if you lived in Hampshire, we could do walk and talks. Visit my website.
And I'll make sure I put the link in the description too.
Thank you, Calvin.
Raushia, thank you so much for today. Listeners, I have been your host today, Calvin Anderson. You've had Raushia Coles. Have a lovely day. Take care. God bless.